I'll tell you the truth, because I'm old now and there's no sense in dressing it up. The first time I ever laid eyes on that girl, I thought she was a deer. It was the back end of October, the year the aspens turned early and the cold came down out of the mountains like it had somewhere to be. I was carrying a pail of scraps out past the smokehouse, and I caught movement up on the ridge where the rocks break open above the creek. Just a flicker, brown and quick and low to the ground. I figured a doe had wandered down looking for water before the snow shut everything up tight. I didn't think on it again that day. I had bread rising and a man to feed and 40 other things pulling at my apron. That was the way of the Caro place. Elias kept cattle, not many, but enough, and the work never let up, and I cooked and cleaned and kept the books because his wife was 3 years in the ground and somebody had to. You learn things, living on a ranch. You learn the difference between a thing that belongs to the country and a thing that's hiding in it. And after a few days, I started to notice the deer that wasn't a deer. Food went missing. Not much. A loaf cooling on the sill would have a corner torn off it, careful like a child sneaking. Twice I left the chicken coop and came back to find an egg gone and the straw pressed down where no fox had been. A fox doesn't fold straw. A fox makes a mess. This was somebody trying to leave it the way they found it. I told Elias. He was at the table that night, hat off, hair flattened where the brim had been, and he listened the way he listened to everything, slow, turning it over before he said a word. Could be a drifter, he said finally, coming down off the pass before it closes. A drifter takes more than a corner of bread, I said. A drifter takes the whole loaf and the knife too. He thought about that. Then it's somebody who's afraid of being caught. That was Elias for you. Other men would have grabbed a rifle and gone looking to put a scare into whoever it was. He sat there with his coffee going cold, and he wondered what a person had to be running from, to steal so gentle. The next morning I saw her plain. I'd risen before light to start the stove, and I looked out the window over the basin while the kettle warmed, and there she was, coming down off the rocks in the gray. She moved like an animal that's been hunted head low, stopping, listening, her whole body strung tight as fence wire. She got to the edge of the garden and she stood a long while just looking at the house. Then she took two of the squash that had frozen on the vine and she went back up the slope, and the rocks closed around her and she was gone. I'll never forget how thin she was. Even at that distance you could see it. She had a man's coat on, too big, the sleeves rolled, and underneath it she was nothing but bones and the will to keep going. I didn't tell Elias right off. I wanted to see her again, to be sure I hadn't dreamed her up. But the next morning she came back, and the morning after, and on the third I understood she'd been living up in the old miner's cave that punched into the ridge above the creek. Men used to work that ground for silver back before the war, and they'd given up on it and the hole was still there, blacker than a closed eye. She was living in a cave, as the snows were coming, alone. When I finally told Elias, I expected him to ride up and roust her out, the way you'd run off a squatter. Instead, he set his fork down and was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. "How long?" he said. "2 weeks, maybe more." "In the cave." "In the cave." He looked out the window toward the ridge. The first real snow had dusted it the night before, just a sugar of it, but everybody knew what came after. "She'll die up there," he said. Not dramatic. Just a fact, the way he'd say a calf was sick or a fence was down. "Then go get her." "You don't go get a thing that's hiding," he said. "You spook it, it runs. And there's nowhere to run to but the mountain, and the mountain'll kill her quicker than I ever could." So he didn't go get her. What he did, I think about it still. That afternoon he carried a basket up the slope, near to the mouth of the cave but not too near, and he set it down on a flat rock where she'd be sure to see it. Bread, a wedge of cheese, dried apples, a wool blanket, his own, the good gray one. And then he walked away without once looking back, and he never said a word toward the dark of that cave, never called out, never made a show of it. I watched from the porch. After he'd gone a long way off, I saw a hand come out of the shadow. Just a hand, white in the gloom, and it pulled the basket in, quick, and then nothing. He did the same the next day, and the next. Always set it down, always walked away. Never waited, never watched. He gave her the one thing I think she hadn't had in a long while, and it wasn't the food, though God knows she needed it. It was the going away. It was him showing her, over and over, that she could take what she needed, and he wouldn't be standing there when she did. A week of that. The snow came down harder, real snow now, and the basket sat one morning untouched. My heart went cold looking at it. Elias saw it too from the barn, and I watched him stand there a minute, and then he did a thing he hadn't done. He walked up to the cave mouth, slow, hands open at his sides, and he sat down on the cold rock a good 20 feet off like a man waiting for a stage, and he started to talk. I couldn't hear the words from where I was, but I could hear the shape of his voice carrying down the basin, low and even, the same voice he used on green horses and frightened calves. He sat there in the falling snow and he just talked to the dark, to a girl he'd never seen up close, for the better part of an hour. And then she came out. She came out like something being born, slow, blinking, her hands up in front of her face against a sky she hadn't stood under in weeks. She was worse up close than I'd feared. Her lips were split with the cold. There was a sickness in her, a rattle when she breathed that I heard later by the stove and didn't like the sound of. And her eyes, I've seen a lot of frightened creatures in my years, and I've never seen eyes like that on a person. She watched Elias the way you'd watch a fire you weren't sure was out. He didn't move toward her. He just stood, real slow, and he held out his hand the way you'd offer it to a dog that's been beaten, palm down, no hurry in it. "There's a stove down there," he said, "and a woman name of Hetty who cooks better than she'll admit. You don't have to talk. You don't have to stay, but you'll freeze up here and I'd take it hard if you did." It took her a long time to come down that slope. He walked ahead of her the whole way, never behind, so she could always see where he was. When she finally crossed into the kitchen and the warmth hit her, she swayed on her feet and I caught her, and she flinched from me so hard she nearly went down again. I didn't take it to heart. I just got her into a chair by the stove and put a blanket on her and a bowl of broth in her two shaking hands. Her name was Marin. That much she told us the first night, in a voice rusted from not being used. Just the one name, nothing else for a long while. She slept 14 hours. When she woke she didn't know where she was and she came up out of that bed swinging, and it took both of us a good while to settle her, talking soft, keeping our distance. After that I stopped going into the room sudden. I'd knock on the doorframe even when there was no door and I'd announce myself, and slow as a season turning, she stopped flinching. The story came out in pieces, over weeks, mostly at night when the dark made it easier. I'll give it to you whole here, though I never heard it whole. She'd been married. Young, the way girls were married then, to a man who'd seemed steady to her people, and turned out to be something else when the door was shut. I won't lay out everything he did to her. Some of it she only told me with her eyes, looking away. But I'll tell you she had a scar across the back of her shoulder, shaped like the buckle of a belt, and another on her arm that had been a break that healed crooked because no doctor was ever called. She'd run twice. The first time he found her at her sister's and took her back, and the sister paid for the hiding of her, and Marin never forgave herself for that. The second time she ran with no plan but the running. She rode his own horse till it went lame, then walked, then climbed, up into country she thought no man would follow her into, because she decided, and this is the part that still puts a stone in my chest, she decided she would rather die cold and free on a mountain than live one more winter under his roof. She found the cave by luck. She'd been living off what the land gave and what she could carry off from a homestead miles below, working her nerve up each time to come down. She'd seen our place and watched it a long while before she dared touch a thing, because every house she'd ever known had a man in it who'd hurt her. "Why'd you take the bread then?" I asked her once. "From here, if you were so afraid of houses." She was quiet and then she said, because he set it down and walked away, a man who set it down and walked away. She turned her cup in her hands. I'd never seen that. Now here is where I have to tell you about the cold thing that came in January, because the story doesn't end with her warm by the stove, much as I wish it did. Marin had started to heal. The rattle left her chest. She put on enough weight that her face came back to her, and Lord, she was handsome when she wasn't half-dead, dark-haired, with a way of going still and listening that she never lost. She took to the work. She was good with the chickens, good with the small things, and she and Elias developed a way of being in a room together that was careful and quiet and getting less careful by the week. He'd ask her opinion on the cattle. She'd give it. He'd take it. I saw it happening before either of them did. The way she stopped tracking the doors. The way he found reasons to be in the kitchen. Then a rider came up the road in the worst of the winter, and Marin was at the window churning butter, and she saw him a long way off, and the cup of her face just emptied, went white. The churn stopped. "It's him," she said. I didn't have to ask who. I'll tell you, that man had tracked her clean across 2 territories. He'd asked at every homestead and trading post, and somebody down the valley had let slip about the new woman up at the Carrow place. And here he came, in a good coat with a good horse, looking for all the world like an honest husband come to collect his runaway wife. The law in those days would have stood right beside him. She was his property by the lights of that time. There was no court that would have heard her. He came into the yard smiling. He had a smile that worked on people, I'll give him that. Elias came out of the barn wiping his hands, and the man tipped his hat and called him neighbor, and said he'd come a powerful long way for his dear wife who'd wandered off in a spell of melancholy, and he was so grateful to find her in good hands. And Marin, behind the window, started to shake so hard the floor under her seemed to move. Now you have to understand what kind of man Elias Carrow was, because what he did in that yard tells it better than anything I could say about him. He didn't shout. He didn't pull a gun, though there was one in the barn and he could have reached it. He didn't even let on at first that anything was wrong. He stood there in the cold with his hand still working the rag, and he listened to the whole smooth speech, the asterisk dear wife and the asterisk spell of melancholy asterisk. And when the man was done, Elias nodded slow, like he was thinking it over. "That's a sad story," Elias said. "A wife wandering off like that, you must have been worried sick." "Day and night," the man said. "And she rode off on your horse, you say?" "My best mare, worth more than the woman, I'll be honest with you, neighbor." And he laughed, expecting Elias to laugh with him, the way men laughed together about their women in those days. Elias didn't laugh. He just kept nodding, and he said, "Funny thing about a horse. Horse runs off, it comes home. It comes back to the barn where it's fed. A horse always comes home if home's a place worth coming to." He let that sit. "Your mare didn't come home. Your wife didn't come home. She climbed a mountain in winter to get away from home." He finally stopped wiping his hands. "I'd think on what that says about the home, mister. Before I went bragging in another man's yard about what my wife was worth." The smile came off the man's face then. I was watching from the window beside Marin, and I felt her go rigid as a fence post. "She's my property," the man said, and the honey was gone out of his voice. "By law, I'll have her and I'll have my horse, and there's not a thing you can do, you sod-busting." "You're right," Elias said. That stopped him. "You're right that the law's on your side," Elias went on, easy as ever, but there was something underneath it now, something I'd never heard in him, low and flat and final. "Law says she's yours. Law says I can't keep her. I know it. You know it." He took one step closer. "But the law's a long way off. The nearest marshal is 60 miles and a closed pass from where you're standing. And out here, mister, in the snow, a long way from any law, out here it's just you and me, and what each of us is willing to do." The yard went very quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold. "She's not going with you," Elias said. "Not today. Not ever. You can ride for the marshal if you like. By the time you get back through that pass, it'll be April, and I'll have had all winter to teach this woman that not every man who comes to her door means to break her. And when you stand in front of that marshal and tell him your wife would rather have died on a mountain than spend one more night under your roof, you tell him that, and you watch his face, and you see whose side the law lands on then. The man stood there working his jaw. He looked at the barn where he knew the rifle was. He looked at Elias, who hadn't moved, who stood there with empty hands and didn't need a gun because there are men whose stillness is more frightening than any weapon. And he looked at the window, at Marin's white face, and he saw, I think for the first time, that she would never come back to him alive. That whatever held her to him had broken on that mountain, and there was no fixing it. He called Elias a few names. He spat in the snow. And then, because cowards always do the arithmetic, he got back on his horse, and he rode out the way he came, and the only sound was the hooves going smaller and smaller down the frozen road until there was nothing left of him at all. He never came back. I won't pretend it was because he found his conscience. I expect he found a different woman to frighten, lower down the valley, the way his kind always does. But he never came back up our road, and that was enough. Marin didn't come away from the window for a long time after he was gone. She stood watching the empty road like she didn't trust it to stay empty. And Elias came in, and he didn't go to her, didn't crowd her, just took off his hat and stood by the door the way a guest would. "He's gone," he said. "For now. For good, but you don't have to believe that yet. You can wait and see." He hung his hat on the peg. "That's allowed. You can take all the time you've got." And she turned from the window then, and she looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at the bread he set down and walked away from, the way you look at a thing you've decided to trust against all the evidence your